She thought stepping onto that stage would be the proudest moment of her life. Instead, the room erupted in whispers, smirks, and laughter, not at what she said, but at who she was. In that instant, the weight of generations of prejudice pressed down on her shoulders. But what came next silenced the entire hall and exposed a truth about racism that no one in that room could ignore. How did one young woman turn humiliation into history?
Her name was Maya, a first-generation college student who would spend her whole life fighting to be seen, not as a stereotype, but as herself. On campus, she carried books heavier than her backpack, chasing grades that could open doors her parents never had the chance to walk through. To most, she was quiet, reserved, the kind of person who blended into the background.
But debate was her secret world. Hours spent in the library, scribbling notes, sharpening arguments, practicing in empty classrooms where no one could laugh at her mistakes. It wasn't just a hobby, it was her proof that she belonged, even in spaces built to keep her out.
When Yale's debate tournament announced its finalists, Maya's name was there. Unexpected, uncelebrated, but undeniable. She prepared the way she always had, in silence, with determination carved into every line of her notebook. What she didn't know was that her greatest challenge wouldn't come from the judges or the arguments. It would come from the very room she was about to walk into.
The auditorium lights felt hotter than the sun. Rows of students and judges filled the room, their whispers echoing like a storm in her chest. Maya clutched her notes so tightly the paper wrinkled in her hands. She wasn't nervous about the argument. She had prepared endlessly for that. What shook her was the laughter, the looks, the way her presence seemed to be a punchline before she even spoke. As she stepped toward the podium, she caught sight of a small group in the front row. They weren't hiding their smirks. One leaned over to the other, murmuring something that made them both chuckle. She knew what it was about. Not her argument, not her skills. Her skin, her accent, her very existence in this space that was never built for her.
She drew a breath, steady but trembling, and began. Her words cut through the air, sharp and deliberate. But even as she spoke, she felt the weight of the room pressing against her. Every pause was filled with muffled snickers, every mistake magnified into fuel for their amusement. Still, she pressed on. Her voice grew stronger, rising over the noise. Some heads turned, not in mockery this time, but in surprise. They hadn't expected her to hold her ground. But the tension only grew. A judge shifted in his seat, frowning as though her argument wasn't just debatable, but somehow inappropriate for her to be making. Another scribbled something down without even glancing at her. The message was clear. Prove yourself, or be forgotten. Her chest burned, not just with nerves, but with anger. She remembered the stories her parents had told her about being overlooked, dismissed, made invisible. And now it was happening again, not in the shadows, but under bright lights, in front of an audience that thought it was entertainment. Still, she didn't stop. She leaned harder into her words, her voice steadying like iron. For the first time, the laughter dimmed. Silence trickled into the room, almost reluctantly. But silence, too, carried its own weight. Was it respect, or was it the silence before a storm? Halfway through, she paused to gather her breath, and that's when it happened. A voice from the crowd, low, cutting, unmistakable. Why is she even here? The room stiffened. No one spoke. No one defended her. The question hung in the air like a verdict. Maya's hands shook, but she gripped the podium tighter. That single sentence threatened to unravel everything, her preparation, her pride, her belief that she belonged. But instead of stopping, she looked straight into the crowd, her eyes steady, and continued. The whispers faded, the smirks faltered. And somewhere in the back of the room, a judge leaned forward, actually listening for the first time. But was it enough? Could her words cut through not just arguments, but prejudice so deeply rooted it refused to stay hidden? Or would the moment end the same way it began, with laughter drowning out her voice? Her voice trembled for only a moment, then steadied like a blade sharpened by fire. Every word cut deeper than the last, exposing truths the room had never wanted to face. The argument was no longer just about debate. It was about dignity, about belonging, about refusing to be silenced. And then, just as her speech reached its peak, it happened. A judge interrupted. His voice was flat, dismissive, dripping with condescension. "That's enough. We've heard this before." The room froze. The sting of those words echoed louder than any laughter. He wasn't just dismissing her argument, he was dismissing her existence, reducing her to a tired stereotype before the final word had even left her lips. Maya felt her throat tighten. For a split second, she thought about stepping back, letting it end here. But something inside her snapped. She wasn't just fighting for points on a scorecard. She was fighting for every person who had ever been told they were too different, too unworthy, too out of place. So she did the unthinkable. She raised her voice, clear, unshaken, defiant. She repeated her closing statement, louder, sharper, impossible to ignore. The auditorium seemed to shrink around her words. For the first time that day, no one dared to laugh. No one whispered. Even the judge who had cut her off shifted uncomfortably in his chair. This was no longer a debate. This was a reckoning. Her final words hung in the air, searing, undeniable. She had laid everything bare, her pain, her strength, her truth. And in that silence that followed, she realized something. Even if they tried to deny her victory, they could never erase the power of what she had just done. But would the world outside that room listen? Or would her courage be swallowed, like so many voices before hers, by the silence of indifference?
When the debate ended, the judges offered their scores. Maya didn't take home the trophy that day. On paper, her performance was dismissed, minimized, written off as unpolished. But everyone in that room knew something had shifted. The same audience that once laughed at her had fallen silent. And silence, she realized, could sometimes speak louder than applause. Maya walked out of that auditorium with no medal in her hand, but with something greater. She had claimed her space in a world that tried to push her out. She had stood unshaken in the face of open mockery and quiet prejudice. And in doing so, she carved out a story that no scorecard could erase. Her courage was not just hers. It was the echo of generations who had been told they didn't belong, and the spark for those still to come. But here's the truth. Maya's story isn't rare. Every day, voices are silenced, potential dismissed, and brilliance overshadowed by prejudice. How many talents have been lost because laughter drowned them out before they had the chance to be heard? Her moment reminds us that racism isn't always loud. It can be hidden in a smirk, a dismissive word, a system that decides who is worthy of recognition. And unless we choose to see it, call it out, and refuse to let it pass, the silence will continue. So the question is, the next time you witness that silence, that dismissal, that laughter, will you turn away? Or will you stand like Maya and refuse to let the story end there?